All right, so now we're moving on to the Unreal portion of this series of tutorials. And the first thing we need to do is get our landscape over and into Unreal. So at this stage, if you've already followed along with Ian's part of this tutorial series, where he goes through setting up this height field and the color map inside Houdini and importing it into Unreal and doing the material setup, you feel free to continue along with where you left off from there. Alternatively, if you've already followed along with the first Project Pegasus release and have a version of the terrain that you created following along from those tutorials, you can just pick up where we left off from there. So it's really up to you. And in this video, we're just going to quickly go over again, exporting a height field from Houdini and importing it into Unreal in the quickest kind of fashion possible before we dive into all of the splines and paths related good stuff. So first of all, I'm just going to use this same height field that I have loaded up inside of Houdini, and I'm just going to basically strip everything off of it that isn't specifically the height. So I can go ahead and put down a blast node and delete non-selected height. And then if I just go and click the little information button here, we can see that now I only have a single sort of volume, a single height field here, and that's what we want to be carrying over to Unreal. Okay, so now that we've got that, I can use a file cache, or I can use a ROP geometry output to export this as a BGO on disk. And I'm going to go ahead and pick a location to save this in. So for me, that's going to be Pegasus 24, projects, and then terrain pathfinding project files. Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and call this the Pegasus 2024 height map. .bgo.sc, like so, and we're going to go ahead and hit save to disk. Okay, so the reason why I'm not just using this same BGO that we imported to begin with is because we have a bunch of other layers. You see we've got base, lowlands, cliffs, rocks, sand, height, etc. And while these are useful and we could use them to drive the material inside of Unreal, at the moment we're only interested in working with the height map. So we're just going to start with a really basic setup. So I'm going to go over to Unreal now. And I've basically just created a new project to go through the setup. So first of all, you're going to want to make sure that you have the Houdini engine enabled if you don't have it enabled already. So I'm not going to tell you how to install the Houdini engine into Unreal because there's plenty of tutorials on that. So this sort of assumes a prerequisite level of knowledge here. And I'm going to go ahead and click File, New, and we're going to create a new basic level. So I'm not going to go to the open world template because I don't want to use world partition in this case. I'm going to go ahead and delete that existing static mesh in the world. So we're just left with a blank level here. And then I'm going to go and make sure that I have the engine content and the plugin content enabled. And then I'm going to go into the engine content. And you can see that I've already got a bunch of filters here. And I'm filtering by blueprint, so you won't have that on by default. But I'm just going to go make sure as well that if I go to this little three sort of lines here and go to the other filters, or is it miscellaneous filters, that I've got my Houdini asset filter turned on. So I'll turn that on. You can see that if I have now the Houdini asset filter enabled with the engine content directory selected, I should add here, if you installed your Houdini engine plugin not to the engine, then you may just have a folder called plugins. So yeah, just have a little look around until you find the folder that contains these kind of placeholder or stock Houdini assets. And I'm going to go for the Houdini BGO import, and I'm just going to right click it and go instantiate at the origin. So you can see that's added the Houdini BGO to our scene there. And it says that it's finished cooking with errors, and the reason for that is because we haven't actually provided it with anything to do. We need to set up the input for this node. So you can see that we've got a geometry file. So we're going to go ahead and click these three little dots, and we've got this selected. And now I'm just going to navigate to where I saved that height field out from Houdini. So I go to Project, Home Project Files, and Pegasus 2024 height map. Okay, and you can see that that loaded things in nice and quickly. So now we have our height map loaded in the correct world space relative to Houdini. And this is important. The fact that I imported it with this digital asset means that it's been scaled, transformed, and everything correctly to match Houdini, which means that if we do any sort of other procedural work inside of Houdini and bring it over to Unreal, it will also be in the correct world space. Now, right now, the landscape is actually attached to the digital asset, and I just want to get rid of this digital asset from my scene now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hit bake. And you can see now that the landscape got renamed and we've still got the digital asset in the scene, but if I go ahead and delete it, we're left with just the landscape. If I tried to delete the digital asset before I did that bake step, then the landscape would have also been deleted because it was connected to the digital asset. Now, this is great because we have just a regular Houdini, regular Unreal landscape. So I'm going to go ahead and click Save Current Level As, and we're going to create a new folder, call it Pegasus 24, and then I'm going to call this L_Pegasus 2024 pathfinding. Okay, so this is now the kind of the base level to do all of the interesting things that we want to do with our terrain. So I'm not interested in the stock Houdini assets anymore, so I'm going to turn off the Houdini asset filter, go back to the content folder and open up my Pegasus 2024 content directory. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about pathfinding, or splines, or roads inside of Unreal at least. Inside of Houdini, we've already set up a bunch of curves which we can use to sort of drive some paths inside of Unreal. So we have some kind of data that we can work with, but I really just set this up as an example of what the tools can do. So we'll have a look at how we can get some of this data into Unreal, but then we're going to start exploring how we can really work with the pathfinding tools as they're intended to be used, which is directly inside of Unreal and interactively, so we can place our waypoints inside of here. Okay, so Unreal provides, by default, if I go up to the landscape editing mode up here, it provides by detail some spline tools. So let's have a little look and see if we can find them. If we go to the Manage tab and then click on Splines, you're going to see that what we can do is just go ahead and if we, I think, control click somewhere on the terrain and then control click somewhere else, it adds straight away this, this spline here. Which we can use to deform the terrain to the spline. We can use it to place objects in the world and so on. The problem is, if we actually apply these spline modifications to the terrain currently, they're going to get applied to this single layer that exists, which means they're going to destructively edit the terrain that we're working on, which we don't like. So I'm just going to Control Z out of there, Control Z again to get rid of that first click. And I'm going to leave the spline editing mode. Actually, I can just leave that selected, but I'm not going to place any splines for the time being. What we're going to look at is we have these this edit layer section. We have currently got only one edit layer. And what you can think of edit layers being is kind of like the stack in like an image editing program. So if we apply changes to a layer, they can get blended with the layer beneath them in a bunch of different ways. And if you modify one layer, then the other layers that you haven't modified sort of don't get affected in any way. So that you sort of have this clean working copy. So I'm going to right click on the layer and I'm going to click Create to create a new layer. And I'm going to call the first layer, I'm going to go ahead and rename that, and I'm going to call that Base for base layer. So that means just sort of the raw procedural terrain coming from Houdini. And then I'm going to go ahead and rename the new layer, and I'm going to call this one Paths. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm also going to lock the base layer. So that means we are no longer able to edit this layer, so it's safe, which means that we know we're never going to accidentally kind of ruin this layer and distort our input data. Now, with the Paths layer, I can go ahead and click Reserve for Splines, and you'll see that it will give you a warning that's going to clear the content, and that's fine, because there is no content there currently. Okay, and you can see now that the Paths layer has the Reserved for Splines written in brackets, and it's also been grayed out, so we can't go ahead and sculpt inside of this layer. In fact, all we can do is use it to create these landscape deformations with the splines. And you can see that this time, instantly, when I control clicked and add that second waypoint and I control click again, adds in the third waypoint, it's going to automatically start to deform the terrain to these splines. So we have quite a nice looking setup here. But you may already be noticing an issue. As cool as this is, if I go ahead and sort of drag this down and I then, like, I don't know, go over to the endpoint and click again over here somewhere, you're going to see that while the path that's been generated does sort of snap to the ground when you control click somewhere, if you actually move that path, you have to kind of modify the height by hand manually. And in addition to that, if you just click somewhere else, every region in between doesn't get snapped to the terrain automatically. And this is by design, I suspect, because they just want this to be sort of a basic spline editing tool. But it's a little bit of a pain when you're creating paths across giant levels. And this is one of the areas in which we can serve, in which Houdini can serve to sort of enhance the way that a tool inside of Unreal already works. So we'll be coming to that in a little bit. Another thing that you might want to sort of think about is that obviously these keyframes are all placed by hand, which is not ideal when you're kind of doing pathfinding across like an entire level, a giant open world. You're going to want to be sort of doing some things in a slightly more automated fashion, probably. So wouldn't it be great if there was a way for Houdini to just write directly to this landscape spline system? Well, fortunately, there is. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to clear the layer of all of the splines that I've added. And then, okay, that's interesting. So we're going to be learning a little bit about how the spline system works in Unreal 2. So you can see that cleared the height deformations, but it didn't actually destroy the splines. So what I need to do now is if I go select all control points and hit delete, then we can see that those have actually been removed from the level. So okay, we're back to like a clean starting point. So how do we get the splines from Houdini into Unreal, and which splines are we going to start with? Why don't we go for the procedurally generated paths that we have here? There's quite a lot of them. So maybe let's not do that actually. Let's just do a whole new one. So I'm going to go and quickly do another Pegasus terrain pathfinding. So I'm just going to copy this. And this time we're going to create a new curve input. So I'm going to clear that one, wire that in. And let's just go and preview that there and just draw a single spline from one mountain to the other. So you can see that already with just 2 clicks using Houdini, we've generated a much more intricate and interesting spline which actually conforms to the terrain. And if we'd done that same thing inside of Unreal, we would have just ended up with a weird kind of bridge between the 2 mountains. Okay, so how do we go about getting this from Houdini to Unreal? Well, it's quite simple. We just need to provide the correct attributes to this spline mesh that's coming out from the pathfinding. So first of all, let's just delete any unnecessary attributes. So anything that we don't want. In fact, we can go ahead and just delete everything. Okay, so we've deleted all the attributes from this spline. And the next thing we're going to do is let's just tidy it up a little bit, because right now the spline mesh is pretty dense. So let me just go and actually, let's see if I can find the thing that I'm looking for. Oh, I've lost it, there we go. So the thing I'm looking for is I want to show the point display, but I've currently toggled my stow bars. So that's why my interface was looking quite clean there. And I'm just going to go and turn on the points. So you can see this is quite a lot of points. And it's worth bearing in mind that the number of points you send from Houdini to Unreal is going to directly affect how sort of optimal or performant the geometry that gets created in Unreal is going to be. So what I can do is let's just put down a little smooth, first of all. So that's going to sort of soften up this spline a little bit, but that's a bit too much. So let's just put auto update on and just interactively drag this here. I'm just going to do it until it sort of feels a little bit cleaner. Let's go and see what we get. There we go, without sacrificing too much of that windiness, because if I go too high, I lose all the windiness, so I want to keep it. So I'm quite happy with that level of smoothing. And then I'm going to go ahead and refine this again. So to refine it, basically that means I'm going to optimize the curve. So I'm going to put first U on 0, second U on 1, then go to unrefine tab and pull up the tolerance. You can see that we start to sort of reduce the number of points on the curve there. And again, I'm going to be careful not to remove too many because I don't actually want to change the shape of my curve too much. I want to keep all of those little windy sort of kinks that sort of give it that natural appearance. So I think that's looking better. If we look at where it was before, where it is now, we look at the point count, we're on 109 points, whereas before we were on 273. So we've just optimized that curve up a little bit there. Okay. So now we need to create the attributes that Unreal is expecting to exist on the spline so that it knows what kind of purpose that we intend to use the spline for. Now, I'm just going to go to the docs here, so the Houdini engine docs, and we're going to go and have a quick little look at the landscape section. I'm going to look at the landscape splines input, and we're just going to see what it says here. So if this has changed since this video has been produced, you'll need to go and check this anyway to see what's going on. And what we're particularly interested in is looking at the attributes that we can set on the geometry. So the most important attribute that we need to set is this one. We need to make sure that we have an attribute that exists on the primitive called Unreal Landscape Spline, and we need to set it to 1. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm just going to use a wrangle. So I'm going to say I at Unreal Landscape. Let's just paste it actually. to avoid any typos. I'm going to set that to be equal to 1. Okay, so there we go. Now we are telling Unreal, or the Houdini engine, to instantiate an Unreal Landscape spline using this curve as the input. But let's have a little look at what else we've got. We can set the rotation. So this is potentially going to be quite important. We want to be able to say, should it lower terrain, what the control point mesh is. And in fact, we have a lot of controls here. And what these controls relate to is the sort of parameters on the spline after it's been created. And since we don't know what it looks like yet, we're going to ignore all of this until we've actually done our first instantiation. And then we're maybe going to play with the parameters a little bit. And let's just keep going down. Yeah, I think let's just stick with this to begin with. So just like we did with the terrain, we're going to use a ROP geometry output to begin with. And we're going to go and make sure we save that into the same location. So Pegasus 2024 for me, project, pathfinding. I'm going to call this Pegasus 2024. And I'm going to go with landscape splines V1. Okay, there we go. Oh, did I actually give it the type that it's supposed to have? Let's just double check that I wrote bgo.rc. Yep, it's all good. So let's go ahead and now save this to disk. Back to Unreal. And just like we did before, let's go down to the engine directory, turn on the Houdini asset filter. We're going to instantiate a BGO import at the origin. We're going to leave the spline editing mode. And then we're going to go click on the Houdini BGO import. And we're going to go down and select the splines that we just exported. There we go. And let's have a little look. Did we get anything? We didn't get any errors. Let's have a little look at the output log. So I'm just going to clear the log and we're going to just click recook and see what happens. So it says that it cooked, but of course we can see that we're not actually getting any splines on the terrain. So why would that be? Well, let's go and have another little look at the attributes that we're supposed to be setting. So we've set that we want it to be an Unreal Landscape spline. But we haven't, if we look right down at the bottom here, we can see that there's another attribute called Unreal Landscape Spline Target Landscape. So I guess that's kind of obvious. How is the spline supposed to know when you can have more than one landscape in your scene in Unreal? How are the splines supposed to know which landscape you're actually targeting? So let's go ahead and just copy the name of the landscape. And let's go into Houdini once more and go back to the wrangle. And I'm just going to go back here. And actually, I think I also forgot I didn't set this wrangle to run over primitives instead of points. So we've got two things that we need to tidy up there. So we'll say Unreal Landscape Spline Target Landscape, and that's going to be a string attribute, and it's going to be equal to landscape. And then the second thing that I forgot is that I didn't set this to be running over primitives. Okay, so let's save that to disk. Let's jump back to Unreal, and then let's just go ahead and I think we could just hit recook, but we maybe need to do more than that. There we go, just a little recook. And look at that, we have our spline already in the inside of Unreal. It's done a pretty decent job. It's sort of getting a bit messed up in certain areas, but overall, quite exciting to see that we already have generated something that quickly. But there's a couple of issues with this workflow that I just want to showcase, and then I'll show you how we can go ahead and deal with those too. So if we jump back over to Houdini, something you might want to do is kind of go and modify that curve that you sent over to Unreal, right? So we just made another modification. We're going to go ahead and overwrite the file. And if we go back to Unreal and then just recook the actor, things could appear to be working. It feels like we have just extended our path. But I'm going to show you why that's not actually correct. We've actually ended up with an issue here, and that issue will be more clear if I make a more drastic modification to our input. So I'm going to go ahead and just completely change the spline now to a different portion of the terrain. I'm going to go ahead and hit save to disk once more. And you might have thought that we'd actually updated our original export. So we sort of just generated this last portion of the spline here. But if I go ahead and hit recook now, you're going to see that it's actually generating an entirely new curve off over to the side and leaving the previous result intact. And for me, this isn't how I would expect the tool to work. This isn't what I would like to happen. I would like the new import to completely erase the previous result. So how can we go about doing that? Well, that's going to my knowledge, there's no sort of attribute we can set. There's nothing that we can modify on the tool. Setting auto bake and replace previous bake doesn't seem to do the trick. And outside of just going and hitting select all control points and deleting them between each run, which isn't really ideal, I don't think there's a way to kind of automate this, except if we start to look into scriptable tools inside of Unreal. So that's what we're going to look at doing the next time. We're going to build a little wrapper around this workflow inside of Unreal, and then we're going to start going deeper and deeper into how we can use scriptable tools with Houdini to really create kind of an awesome interactive workflow. So that's what we're going to do in the next video.